Leonard Rosen and Jack Rosen sold America a televised cure for baldness before they sold it a Florida city called Cape Coral. They wrote contracts on lots inside a city of nearly 200,000 people before a single canal had been dug. Cape Coral is remembered as a badly planned maze of dead-end canals, and yet the record holds something larger, the biggest mail-order land operation the country had ever seen, run by two men who had already sold one cure. $10 down, 100 square miles of swamp, 400 miles of canals, more than any city on Earth. Nearly 200,000 residents today. A city sold before it was a city. The record does not yet say how a city is sold to people who will never see it, what the company did in the rooms it built to listen, why it raised a garden to hide a swamp, or what Florida did the day it finally moved on the brothers. This is the story of a city sold before it existed. It began with a bald sheep. Chapter 1. The Men Who Sold a Cure for Baldness. The bald sheep was not a joke. It was an argument, and it was the first thing Leonard Rosen and Jack Rosen ever built to sell on a television screen. Before either brother had ever stood on the Florida mangrove that would one day make him rich, the two of them were mixing a hair tonic in a Baltimore bathtub and selling it under a brand name that belonged to no living man. They called it Charles Antell. The tonic itself was Formula No. 9, and its one promise was lanolin, the heavy wax rendered from raw sheep's wool. The logic ran backward, from the animal to the man on the couch. Sheep grow wool in abundance, wool holds lanolin, and no one, the brothers told the camera, has ever seen a bald sheep. In the earnest voice of a man reporting a discovery, the pitch pressed the whole syllogism into a single televised line. Have you ever seen a bald sheep? The question answered itself, and the answer was a bottle. On the screen, the pitch did not hurry. It filled the minutes with the bottle held up to the studio light, with the name Charles Antell repeated until it sounded like a house already trusted, with the promise turned over and over until a viewer at home reached for a pen and the mailing address. What made the pitch new was not the grease, it was the length of it. Most advertisements of the early 1950s ran a minute or less between programs on the new television sets. The brothers bought blocks of airtime that stretched from 5 minutes to a full half hour and filled every second with the product. It was among the first long-form television selling the country had ever watched, the direct ancestor of the infomercial, and it moved wool wax at a scale that startled even the men pouring it into bottles. By the Federal Trade Commission's own later accounting, the Charles Antell operation was spending in the neighborhood of $8 million a year on that advertising, a sum that bought a national audience and a national appetite for a remedy squeezed from the back of a sheep. The appetite was also the evidence. In December of 1953, the Federal Trade Commission entered an order against the Charles Antell advertising, finding the claims made for Formula No. 9 to be false. Lanolin could coat a strand of hair. It could not grow one, and it could not wake the dead follicle that the television audience had been told, night after night, it would revive. The order changed the wording on the label and reached almost nothing else, because by the time it was entered in the Commission's docket, the brothers had already taken from Charles Antell the two things they had come for. One was a fortune, the other was a proven instrument. Here the record forks, and it does not close. There are two ways to hold what these men were, and I will set them down side by side. In one reading, Leonard Rosen and Jack Rosen were the great American salesmen of the television age, men who grasped the new medium before almost anyone and would go on to conjure an entire city out of open water, a place 250,000 people now call home. In the other, they were two pitchmen who had just been caught selling grease to the bald, and who would spend the next decade selling mud to families who trusted a machine in the living room. If you have worked through the old contracts and the court file, weigh the two readings against each other and set down in the comments the one the paper actually supports. The instrument was the thing that survived the order. It was the long televised voice, patient and reasonable and unhurried, that could make a stranger 1,000 miles away believe in something he had never touched and would never hold. Beneath the voice sat a colder discovery. The product had not needed to work. It had only needed to be sold, at length and on camera, and to enough people at once, and the wool wax had gone on selling even after a federal agency called its central claim a lie. The bald sheep had proved the method, and nothing about the method was bound to hair, or to wax, or to the animal that began it. The voice could be turned on anything a person wanted badly enough to buy on faith. The brothers had sold the country one cure, a remedy for baldness wrung from the wool of sheep. 1,000 miles to the south, 100 square miles of mangrove and standing salt water waited without a name and without a buyer, unseen by every stranger who would soon own a piece of it. The cure had come out of a bathtub. The next thing they sold would come out of a swamp. Chapter 2. 100 square miles of swamp. The next thing they sold came out of a swamp, and the swamp had a name before it ever had a buyer. It sat on the western bank of the Caloosahatchee River, a low tongue of red mangrove and tidal flat across the water from the small gulf town of Fort Myers, and on the old survey maps it was marked Redfish Point. Leonard Rosen came down from Baltimore to walk it in the middle of the 1950s, carrying the fortune made from a bottle of wool wax and the instrument that had made it. What he walked out onto was not a city and not a farm, and not anything a man could cross with dry shoes. It was mangrove root and sawgrass and standing salt water, threaded with oyster bar and tidal creek, inhabited by mosquitoes and wading birds and almost nothing else. To nearly any buyer in America, it was worthless ground. To a man who had already learned that a product did not have to work, only to be sold at length to enough people at once, it was the largest blank page on the continent. He bought it the way a careful man buys a thing he doesn't want the seller to understand. The purchase opened with the Redfish Point tract, and from there it spread outward through Lee County parcel by parcel, quietly, so that no single landholder along the river grasped that he was one small square in a design meant to swallow the whole coast. The genius of the buying lay in the very fact that made the land cheap. Mangrove flat that flooded twice a day was of no use to a farmer, a rancher, or a builder, and so it changed hands for little more than the taxes owed on it. The brothers were not buying farmland or building sites at all. They were buying raw wetland by the square mile at swamp prices, meaning to sell it back to the country by the lot at the price of a dream. And the distance between those two numbers was the entire enterprise. The figures, when they were finally added up, carried the flat astonishment the brothers built their whole business on. The first tract ran to 1,724 acres. For it they paid $678,000. Around it, over the months that followed, they assembled until the holding reached roughly 103 square miles of mangrove and muck, an expanse larger than many of the American cities whose residents would one day buy into it. And in January of 1958, on raw ground that was still mostly swamp, Gulf American Land Corporation opened a sales office on Redfish Point and set about turning that muck into merchandise. The land had a name by then, and the name was the first thing manufactured on the site. The brothers called it Cape Coral, a phrase that promised a cape and a coral coast where the survey showed neither, only a flat, drowned shelf that reached no headland and grew no reef. The word had been chosen the way the hair tonic's name had been chosen, for the picture it put in a stranger's head, and the picture was already for sale while the ground beneath it lay under the tide. Between that swamp and the city on the brochure stood a single machine, and the whole enterprise turned on what the machine could do. The instrument was the dredge, a floating drag line that gnawed a channel through the muck and flung what it dug to either side. Every canal it cut manufactured two things in one motion. The trench itself became a waterway, straight and blue in the aerial photograph. The spoil hauled out of the trench, the wet marl and shell and black muck, was heaped along both banks until it dried and settled into ground that stood a few feet above the reach of the tide. That heaped and dried spoil was the lot. The water beside it, which was nothing but the hole the lot had been lifted out of, was the amenity. The dredge did not build a waterfront next to a canal. The canal and the waterfront were a single act, one bucket load of muck seen from two sides. A family would be sold the frontage on a ditch the company had charged itself nothing to imagine, and the ditch would be printed on the plat as waterfront. It was terraforming sold as real estate, and it scaled precisely the way the television pitch had scaled. One dredge cutting one canal produced a double row of buildable rectangles along a strip of former swamp. A fleet of dredges cutting a grid of canals could produce them by the thousand, each lot a panel of dried spoil with water on one edge, each one a thing that had not existed the week before the bucket reached it. The machine did not drain the wetland or improve it. It inverted the wetland, lifting the bottom of the marsh into the sunlight and leaving a trench where the bottom had been, and every trench it opened was another straight line of inventory waiting on a name and a number. What the office on Redfish Point had to sell in that first winter, then, was almost entirely paper. The dredges had only begun to open the first canals. The great majority of the tract was still the mangrove it had been for 10,000 years, unbridged and unbuildable, and, in the low places, still awash at high water. But paper the company held in abundance. There were plat maps ruled into numbered blocks, engineering drawings of canals not yet cut, and brochures printed with palm trees and blue water and the clean geometry of a city that existed nowhere but on the page. Gulf American was not selling the swamp as it was. It was selling the drawing of what the dredge would someday make of it, and it meant to sell the drawing faster than any dredge could make it true. By the end of that winter, the whole apparatus stood in place. The brothers held the land, all 100-odd square miles of it. They held the machine that could carve a coastline out of it on command. They held an office, a company, a coined name, and a stack of maps promising a city. What they did not hold, and what no amount of dredging would ever throw up out of the muck, was a single human being willing to pay for a rectangle of drained spoil site unseen. The lots existed mostly as ink on a plat. The people who would fill them were not in Florida and had never seen Florida. They were in Ohio and Michigan and New Jersey, sitting in front of their television sets in the evening, and the brothers already knew the one voice on earth that could cross that distance and make a stranger believe. The swamp was ready. The buyers were not, and they were 1,000 miles to the north. Chapter 3. $10 down and a nation on the line. The brothers had all that dried spoil to sell, and not one buyer within 1,000 miles of the mangrove it was heaped upon, and the thing they built to cross that distance was not a road or a railroad, but a single line of type on a printed contract. The line read $10 down and $10 a month, and in those 7 words Gulf American solved the only problem the dredges had left it. A family in Dayton or Toledo did not need savings, a lawyer, or a train ticket to Florida to become a landowner. It needed $10 and a stamped envelope. The down payment was a $10 bill folded into a direct mail reply card, and the rest arrived in the same small amount, month upon month, in a coupon book the company mailed to the kitchen table. There was no bank anywhere in the arrangement at all. That absence was the mechanism, not an accident of it. An ordinary land sale of the era ran through a bank. The buyer borrowed, the seller was paid in full at the closing, and the mortgage became the bank's problem thereafter. Gulf American cut the bank out and became the bank. It sold the lot and financed the lot in one motion, holding the paper itself, collecting the $10 a month directly into its own Fort Myers ledgers, and keeping the deed in a filing cabinet until the final coupon was torn from the book. What a buyer received on the day of the sale was not a rectangle of Florida, but a printed promise to be handed one someday, once the payments were complete and once some dredge, years out, had reached that particular square of muck. The company had already inverted the swamp with a drag line. Now it inverted the sale. The inversion was the whole of the business, and it was the part the palm tree brochures were built to hide. A lot of dried spoil sitting unbuilt on a tidal flat earned the company nothing. A contract written on that same lot earned it $10 a month for years, at interest, from a wage earner who would go on paying long after the thrill of owning Florida had cooled. The land was inert. The paper was alive. Each signed installment agreement was an asset Gulf American could enter on its books, borrow against, and sell forward to other financiers, a thin stream of coins flowing south out of a living room in Ohio and pooling in Lee County. The small sum disguised the size of the whole. $10 a month felt like nothing across a kitchen table, but totted up over the years a contract ran, and swollen by the interest folded into it, the payments came to far more than the mangrove lot could ever have fetched from a person who actually saw it. The product the brothers manufactured was never truly the lot. It was the contract, and the lot was only the photograph printed on the front of it. To write those contracts by the tens of thousands, the brothers aimed the same instrument that had built their first fortune at the entire map of the country. The televised pitch that had once sold a bottle of hair tonic now sold a plot in Cape Coral, filmed on the principle they had never once abandoned, that a thing did not have to work, only to be shown at length to enough people at the same time. Long broadcasts ran in the evenings across Ohio and Michigan and New Jersey, narrated over aerial footage of blue canals and clean street grids, aimed squarely at what the company itself called average folks. Behind the broadcasts stood rooms full of telephones and a direct mail operation that pushed brochures and reply cards into millions of mailboxes so that a single card returned from a farm town set a Gulf American salesman dialing a Baltimore switchboard that same night. The entire apparatus was engineered to reach a stranger in a chair in front of a television set and make him a Florida property owner before he rose from it without his ever having walked the ground, met a neighbor, or seen the water his lot was printed to face. For the buyer, the arithmetic itself was the seduction. $10 was a sum a machinist or a schoolteacher could surrender without a second thought, less than a week of groceries, and in exchange it conferred a word that had rarely belonged to people of their means. They were landowners. They held property in Florida. A shipping clerk in a gray northern winter could tell the men on his loading dock that he owned waterfront in the Sunshine State, and the coupon book on the mantel was the proof of it, $10 at a time. That the waterfront was a trench not yet cut, on a lot no dredge might reach for years, changed nothing about the pride, because the pride ran on the paper, and the paper was real even in the winters when the land was not. Salesmen learned to sell exactly that feeling. They were not selling drained mangrove by the acre. They were selling the moment a factory town resident signed his name and walked home a Florida landholder, and that moment cost only a $10 bill and a signature. And yet the machine had one limit the brothers understood better than any man alive. A voice on a television screen and a card in the mail could open a stranger, could warm him, could carry him as far as the telephone and the first $10. What neither could reliably do was close him. A man alone in his front room could always set the brochure down on the side table, let the enthusiasm cool overnight, and decide by morning that he did not, after all, wish to buy a rectangle of a swamp he had never seen with his own eyes. Every contract left unsigned at that hour was a lot returned to inventory. Leonard Rosen knew, from the hair tonic and from every sale before it, that the surest close was the one made in person, on the ground, with the prospect standing in Florida sunlight and a salesman at his elbow. So the company set out to erase the last distance it had left standing. The buyers would not cross 1,000 miles to the mangrove on their own. The brothers would carry them across it. Gulf American would put the prospect aboard an airplane, fly him down to the raw edge of Cape Coral, and sell him the swamp while he stood upon it. The airplanes were already waiting on the runway. Chapter 4. The Rooms Built to Listen. The fleet of small propeller planes that Gulf American kept idling on a Florida airstrip was not a courtesy to its buyers, but the sharpest instrument the company owned, built to finish the one thing a television screen and a mailed brochure could never close by themselves. A voice in a living room could warm a man as far as the first payment, but it could not stand at his elbow when the enthusiasm cooled overnight. So they turned the last distance itself into a product. Gulf American advertised cheap excursions to Cape Coral, weekend trips priced so low that a machinist in Ohio or a schoolteacher in Michigan could accept one almost without deciding to, and it carried the prospect and his wife south aboard the company's own aircraft from a cold northern airfield. The seats were sold at a fraction of what the flights cost to fly, and every dollar the company surrendered on the airplane it expected to recover many times over once the couple was standing on the land itself. From the moment the visitors stepped down onto the Florida tarmac, they had walked into a machine engineered to end with a signature, though nothing around them was built to feel like a machine at all. They were driven along the finished stretches of canal and clean street grid, the narrow band of the property that the dredges had already lifted out of the water and made fit for a photograph, and the mangrove beyond it was kept carefully out of view. The schedule left no unmanaged hour. From the airfield to the canals to the dinner table, the couple's days in Florida were arranged by the company that had flown them down, so that at no point during the visit were the two of them alone with their own second thoughts and a road back home. Then they were brought to the clubhouse, and the true architecture of the operation closed around them. Gulf American had built a guest lodge for precisely these visitors, a place to feed them, house them overnight, and hold them inside the company's reach from the airplane to the contract without a gap through which a doubt might slip out. The guest rooms of that clubhouse were wired. Hidden microphones had been set into the rooms where the couples slept, so that when a husband and wife shut their door for the night and spoke to each other in what they believed was complete privacy, a company salesman in another room sat listening to every word they said. The most valuable conversation in any land sale is the one held with no salesman in the room, the plain exchange in which a couple tells each other what they can truly afford and what they are truly afraid to lose, and the brothers had found a way to be present for that conversation without ever being seen. By morning, the salesman assigned to the couple knew which of the two wanted the lot, and which of them was frightened of it. He knew the highest figure the husband had named in the dark as the ceiling he would not cross, and he knew the exact objection the wife had raised against it. And he came down to the breakfast table already holding the answers to fears his prospects had never once spoken to his face. The working creed of the sales force made no secret of what the whole apparatus was for. Among the men who closed the deals on the sales floor, the rule traveled as a single flat sentence. Take them. If we don't, someone else will. It was not a theory of persuasion, but a license for capture, a justification passed hand to hand among the salesmen to override any hesitation before it could set, and it treated the couple flown down at the company's expense not as guests, but as inventory that had to be converted before the return flight carried it home unsold. All of that choreography narrowed in the end to a single evening and a single table. The visit was built to climax at a closing dinner, an unhurried and generous meal at which the prospect, loosened by the flight and the warmth and the sight of the completed canals, was seated across from the very salesman who had spent the night listening through the wall. Everything the couple had confided to the darkness of the guest room was now laid out, invisibly, on the dinner table between them. When the husband raised the same private worry he had spoken in bed, the salesman met it and dissolved it before it was fully formed. When the wife drew back at the price, the figure set before her had already been measured against the ceiling she had named to no one but her husband. The installment contract lay ready beside the plate, and the pen beside the contract, and the entire machinery of airplanes and lodging and hidden wire existed for no other reason than to bring that pen to that hand at that table on that night. For the couples who signed, and most of them did sign, the trip felt like the most gracious hospitality of their lives. They flew back north believing they had been courted and honored, when in truth they had been surveilled in their sleep, outflanked by their own overheard doubts, and closed by men who had turned an ordinary act of trust into a steady source of intelligence. And yet there remained a single weakness in the beautiful machine, one the brothers saw more clearly than any salesman on the floor. The land was still a swamp. The finished canals paraded before the fly-in couples were only a thin, bright rind of the property, and past the photographed street grid lay the rest of the property, mile after mile of mangrove and standing salt water that no dinner and no wired bedroom could hide from a visitor who wandered too far or looked too long. A couple carried all that way to be sold under Florida sunlight had to be given a Florida worth the journey, and the raw edge of Cape Coral, for all its graded streets, was not yet a place that could bear a close and wandering look. So, before the next season of airplanes brought the next season of buyers down to the tarmac, the brothers resolved to build them something to land in, a paradise staged upon the mud itself, made for the single purpose of being believed. Chapter 5. The Garden That Hid the Mud. The paradise the brothers had promised themselves did not grow out of the mangrove on its own. It was surveyed, planted, and wired like a stage, and in the spring of 1964 it opened its gates to the fly-in couples under the name of Cape Coral Gardens. On a graded tract a short drive from the finished canals the visitors were shown, Gulf American laid out formal rose gardens, where a few years earlier there had been only salt marsh and standing brown water. The company filled the flower beds with a density of color that no acre of the surrounding Florida swamp had ever produced on its own, rows of cultivated roses tended by a paid grounds crew and set against clipped lawns that ran green all the way to a canal bank. At the heart of the grounds stood the attraction the company called Waltzing Waters, an electrified fountain rigged so that tall jets of water rose and fell in time to music while colored lamps lit the climbing spray from beneath. It was a choreography of hidden pumps and submerged lights dressed up as a dance, an engineered spectacle of moving water and shifting color that ran for the crowds gathered on the benches in the warm Florida evening. The gardens drew ordinary Florida sightseers as well, families who paid at the gate to see the roses and the dancing fountains, and their presence lent the place the settled public air of a town that had always been there. But every rosebed and every lit jet in that garden had been built for one audience above all, the machinist from Ohio and the schoolteacher from Michigan who had been carried south and set down among the flowers to have their faith confirmed. For those couples, the gardens were the first proof their own eyes had ever been given that the paradise on the mailed brochure was a real place standing in the real sun. They had staked a month of wages and a corner of their future on a Florida lot bought over a telephone line or across a paper reply card, sight unseen. And here at last was a Florida that looked exactly like the promise they had signed their names to. They walked the manicured gravel paths between the rose beds, believing every petal of it. They stood their wives beside the blooms for a photograph, and they watched the colored water climb to the music as people who were sure now that they had chosen well. They carried the memory of that garden back to the cold northern towns they had flown down from, and for many of them it stood for the rest of their lives as the afternoon Florida had proven itself true. The garden had been engineered backward from that belief, and Leonard Rosen understood better than any salesman on his floor what such a place was worth to a hesitating buyer. The roses were chosen because a rose reads instantly and without argument as permanence, cultivation, and care, the very qualities an undrained mangrove swamp could not offer a visitor on its own. The fountains were timed to music because motion and color hold a wandering eye and keep it from drifting toward the raw tree line beyond the lawn, and the whole green tableau was watered and lit at the company's expense so that a couple softened by roses and lamplight carried that softness intact to the salesman waiting elsewhere on the property. Nothing in the garden had been grown for its own sake, and nothing planted there was meant to outlast its usefulness to a sale. The clearest measure of what Cape Coral Gardens had always been for lay in the date Gulf American chose to close it. The gardens shut their gates in August of 1970, and they did not close because the roses had failed, or the fountains had broken, or the sightseers had stopped arriving at the entrance. They closed because by that summer the lots the garden had been raised to sell were sold, and a rose garden maintained to move real estate had no further reason to be watered once the real estate was gone. The flower beds that had testified so persuasively to a paradise were surrendered to the weeds the moment they finished testifying, and the electrified fountain that had danced for 6 seasons of fly-in couples went dark and still the instant there were no more couples the company needed to convince. The garden had always been a set, raised for an audience of buyers, and struck the hour the run of buyers closed, and the speed with which it was abandoned said plainly what 6 years of roses never had. And yet the garden had done its one job with precision, and the reason it worked was the same reason it was dangerous. It worked because the couple standing among the roses and the colored water was never once permitted to walk past the edge of the manicured ground. Beyond that edge, past the last planted bed and the last bright fountain and the clipped green lawn, lay the rest of the property those same couples had already bought and already paid the first coupon on. That ground had never felt a dredge or a drainage ditch, had never been lifted out of the tide or made into anything a photograph could use, and it ran on for mile after mile of salt marsh under the same Florida sun that lit the roses. The garden had shown the buyers one perfected acre and let them believe they had purchased a perfected city. The rest of the ground was the problem, and the rest of the ground was very nearly all of it. Chapter 6. The Lots Beneath the Water. What every fly-in couple actually owned was not the perfected acre of the rose garden, but the rest of the ground, and the rest of the ground was salt marsh. A Cape Coral contract entitled its holder to a single numbered rectangle drawn on a Gulf American plat map, a lot number and a block number printed inside a neat lattice of streets and canals inked across the sheet. On that paper, the lot sat along a waterway, a few steps from open water, exactly as the mailed brochure had promised the machinist in Ohio who had signed his name to it. At the actual coordinate the plat described, in a great many cases, there was no canal, no street, no survey stake driven into the mud to mark a corner, and frequently no dry land at all. The distance between the two Cape Corals, the clean grid printed on the plat and the flooded mangrove standing under the Florida sun, was the whole of the unease that the finished garden had been built to keep a visitor from ever measuring. For a large share of the lots the company had sold, the drag line the salesman had described so vividly had not come, would not come for years, and across the lowest ground would never come at all. The canal front the printed contract guaranteed was, in plain fact, a ditch that had not yet been cut through marsh still lying beneath the tide, so that the water frontage a buyer had paid for did not exist, and the acre it was meant to border sat under standing salt water. Much of the platted ground was not a permanent lake, and not reliably dry either, but seasonal marsh that lay a few inches under the summer rains and hardened toward the winter, land that answered to the Florida wet season and not to the tidy grid a draftsman had ruled across an aerial photograph of it. The grid itself was the device that made the whole inventory possible, for a rectangle drawn on a drawing board costs the same to ink whether the ground beneath it is a buildable rise or 4 feet of tannin-dark water, and Gulf American had ruled its numbered rectangles clear across both without distinction. A man who drove the long highway down to walk the lot he had been paying on found no address, no road turning off the pavement, no numbered corner, only a sweep of mangrove and sawgrass and brown water running unbroken to the flat horizon. His rectangle existed with perfect precision on the Lee County plat and in the coupon book on his kitchen table, and nowhere that a boot could stand. He owned a described place he could not find, could not build upon, could not reach, and in the wettest stretches could not have located without a boat, and, because the company still held the deed against a coupon book not yet emptied, he could not even be said to fully own the water his lot lay under. This was not a flaw in the Cape Coral operation. It was the operation. The company had sold the paper, and the paper earned its monthly sum whether or not the ground beneath it was ever lifted out of the water. So the greater part of the platted ground lay exactly as the mangrove had always lain, undredged and unbuildable, while the payments on it arrived on schedule from 1,000 northern towns. And Cape Coral was not the only Florida swamp the brothers had platted and sold in this fashion. Down the same Gulf Coast, in the low wet country east of the city of Naples, Gulf American had opened a second and far larger tract and marketed it to the nation under the name Golden Gate Estates. The country the company had platted there ran eastward from Naples toward the Great Cypress Swamp, a wilderness of wet prairie and standing cypress that drained slowly or did not drain at all, and onto that wilderness the company projected a subdivision of streets and home sites as confidently as it had projected one across the Cape Coral mangrove. The figures of the Naples tract dwarfed the swamp the company had started on at Redfish Point. Golden Gate Estates covered roughly 173,000 acres of Florida wetland, a domain of sawgrass and cypress and slow black water laid out on the drafting table as a grid of avenues and lots. The company sold those acres, lot by numbered lot and coupon book by coupon book, to about 40,000 separate buyers scattered across the northern states. And a great many of the lots, those 40,000 people signed their names to sat, like the worst of the Cape Coral rectangles, under open water. It was the same machine turned upon a second stretch of swamp, the same numbered grid drawn over the same standing marsh, the same distant buyer paying every month toward a Florida acre that no dredge was scheduled to reach. Between the two tracts the company had sold, on paper, an enormous inventory of Florida home sites that were not home sites at all, but cypress and mangrove and open water waiting on a canal that had been drawn on a plat and promised in a brochure and, across much of the ground, planned in no ledger anywhere. For years the arrangement held, because the buyer in Ohio rarely came, and the buyer who did come and found water where his lot was supposed to be was a single voice, standing alone on a highway shoulder with a contract in his hand and no one obvious to carry it to. But one by one, those voices began to reach the desks of Florida officials, letters from people in distant states describing a canal that was not there, a road that did not exist, a numbered lot that could not be found, a payment that came due every month on ground the writer had at last seen and could not walk across. The letters collected slowly, in a state that for years had let its own future be sold by the coupon book, with almost no one assigned to read them. A government that had stood aside while the Cape Coral marsh and 173,000 acres of Naples wetland were platted and sold to people who would never see them was, slowly and belatedly, beginning to notice. The state had let all of it happen. Now it was starting to look. Chapter 7. The State That Was Not Watching. The complaint letters that had begun to reach the desks of Florida officials arrived at a government that had built no office to receive them, assigned no clerk to read them, and written no law to answer them. For the better part of a decade, the state had let its own coastline be sold in precisely this manner, one installment contract at a time, to buyers far to the north who signed their names for ground they had never crossed. The land business that had risen along the Caloosahatchee and spread eastward toward the Cypress country was, in the eyes of the state that hosted it, very nearly invisible, a private traffic in paper conducted between a company in Fort Myers and a machinist in Ohio, with Florida standing between the two of them and watching neither. There had been no fraud statute drawn to fit the mail-order lot, no bureau charged with reading a brochure against the marsh it described, no inspector sent down the long state highway to stand where a salesman had promised a canal and find instead the standing water. The great subdivisions had been platted, recorded in the county courthouse, and marketed to the whole of the nation with no more state oversight than a clerk gave to the filing of a map. Florida, in the plainest of terms, had sold its own future by the coupon book for years, and had appointed no one to mind the sale. What changed was not the conscience of the state, but the sheer volume of the mail. The letters, which for years had come in one at a time and been filed into a drawer and forgotten, began to arrive at the State House in numbers no filing cabinet could quietly absorb, each envelope describing the same impossible property in a different hand. One buyer wrote that the paved road named on his deed did not exist anywhere on the ground. Another wrote that the lot he had paid on for 3 years lay under water. He had waded into himself. A third enclosed the company's painted brochure and asked the state to hold its bright canal against the photograph of the brown marsh he had driven the length of the peninsula to see. Set side by side on a single desk, the letters stopped reading as the private misfortunes of scattered strangers and began to read as the signature of one machine, the same complaint repeated across both of the company's great tracts and across a continent of distant mailboxes. A government that could ignore a single aggrieved buyer standing on a highway shoulder could not indefinitely ignore a mailbag of them, every letter measuring the identical distance between a plat drawn on a table and the wet ground it claimed to render. And so the state that had watched nothing at last built the instrument to watch it. Out of that accumulating complaint, Florida created a land sales board, a body charged for the first time with licensing the men who sold the state's land on the installment plan and with holding their printed promises to account against the ground that lay beneath them. The Land Sales Board was a small thing measured against the traffic it was meant to govern, a single new desk in a capital that had run for years without one, and yet its creation marked the precise hour the vacuum ended. If this is the kind of story you came to Empire of Acres for, the slow account of how an empire built on paper and drained swamp was finally met by the law it had spent a decade outrunning, then I would ask you to subscribe. I will keep bringing you the men who sold the American future by the acre, and the reckonings that came, late and imperfect, to collect on what they had done. For the first time, a company that wished to sell a Florida lot by mail answered to an office in Tallahassee that could demand to see the lot. The new board did not have to search long to find its largest subject. Of all the companies then selling Florida marsh to the northern states, none had sold more of it, to more people, over more television screens, than Gulf American, and the brothers' operation stood at the head of any list a regulator in the capital might think to draw. The company that had built its whole fortune in the absence of a watcher now conducted its business under one, and the very qualities that had made it the most successful land seller in the state, its scale, its visibility, the enormous count of its recorded contracts, made it the most conspicuous target the board possessed. Investigators began to gather what Gulf American had for years produced in perfect confidence: the aerial brochures, the county plats, the recorded guarantees of canals and streets and waterfront, and to lay each document down beside the actual wet ground it described. The machinery of the state, so long left idle, began slowly to turn, and it turned toward the two men who had built an empire on the certainty that it never would. For years the brothers had operated as though Florida would never look, and for years they had been exactly correct. In 1967, after a decade of looking away, the state finally moved on Gulf American. What it chose to do in that year would say more about the fraud than the fraud itself. The reckoning had a date now. It did not yet have a price. Chapter 8. $5,000. The price, when the state of Florida at last set one, was $5,000. That was the figure entered against Gulf American in 1967, written into the record of a land sales board proceeding in Tallahassee that ran for a matter of days rather than the years the company's traffic across the peninsula might have justified. Brought at last before the board it had watched come slowly into being, the largest seller of Florida land in the country did not contest what the state's investigators had assembled from its own filing cabinets, the aerial brochures, and the county plats, and the recorded guarantees of canal and street and waterfront. The company entered a plea of guilty to 5 counts of misleading practices, conceding on the record the exact distance its own documents measured between the bright water it had painted and the brown marsh it had deeded. And for that plea, for the 5 counts, for the 100 square miles of mangrove the brothers had sold by mail and by television to buyers in every state of the Union, the punishment the board handed down was a suspension of 30 days. For 30 days, Gulf American could not sell a Florida lot to anyone, anywhere, and the switchboards in the Cape Coral sales offices would go quiet. Alongside the suspension came the fine of $5,000 and a term of probation of roughly 150 days, through which a small detail of state monitors, 5 men assigned to sit inside the operation would watch the salesmen work. Then the 30 days would end, the 5 monitors would gather their files and go, and the company would return to the business of selling the swamp exactly as before. The board had not revoked the company's license, and it had not closed the sales rooms, and it had not undone a single one of the contracts already signed for ground that lay under standing water. It had idled the largest land operation in Florida for the length of 1 month, collected from it a sum a suburban family might spend on a used car, and posted 5 men at the door to watch it resume. The record of the state's first true reckoning with Gulf American fit in its entirety on a single page. Set that page beside the ledger the company kept, and the arithmetic of the thing came into a hard and simple focus. $5,000 was the price the state placed on a fraud that had moved a whole coastline of Florida, that had written installment contracts to buyers in cities the salesman would never visit, that had platted and sold a second vast tract in the cypress country near Naples to some 40,000 more. It was a sum the company could have drawn from a single afternoon's mail, from one day's coupons arriving at the Fort Myers offices in their thousands, each carrying the small monthly payment of a distant buyer. The suspension was shorter than a Florida winter, and the fine was smaller than the commission on a single-choice lot, and the probation was a season of supervision that ended precisely when the state's attention did. The board had been built to hold the printed promise against the ground, and it had held Gulf American's promise against the ground, and it had found the promise false on 5 separate counts, and it had answered the finding with a slap. There was, in the length of that record, a pattern older than the Land Sales Board, older than Cape Coral, older than the first dragline the brothers had thrown into the marsh. This was not the first time a government of the United States had found the 2 men selling a miracle they could not deliver, and answered the finding with a penalty they could afford. Years before Florida, before a single acre of swamp had been platted, a federal commission had ordered the same 2 men to stop advertising a cure for baldness, and the order had cost them the advertisement and almost nothing else. The men who had already sold 1 cure had now sold a second, a whole coastline of it, drained and dredged and mailed out on the installment plan, and the law had met the second exactly as it had met the first, with a written finding and a small bill and no hand laid on the fortune underneath. Twice a public body had looked closely at the brothers' salesmanship and pronounced it false, and twice the pronouncement had come with a price the brothers could pay and keep selling. The difference, the second time, was only the scale of what the finding left untouched, for the false claim in Baltimore had been a bottle of tonic, and the false claim in Florida was a city. The state of Florida had spent the better part of a decade building the instrument that would finally read the brothers' brochures against their marsh, and when the instrument at last did its work, its whole verdict weighed $5,000. Whether that was the law catching a fraud or the law naming a fee is a question the record leaves open on the page, and the numbers sit there beside one another and say what they say. What the board could not have known, as it fixed its modest fine and set its 5 monitors and cleared its single-page docket, was that the sum it had chosen so carefully was already beside the point. The fine was cheap because the brothers had no intention of being present to pay the true cost of anything. While the state assembled its counts and negotiated its plea and counted out its 30 days, Leonard and Jack Rosen were already arranging the transaction that would carry the entire company, its land and its debts, and its coupon books, and its wet, unbuildable lots, out of their hands and into someone else's, and out of the reach of any board that Florida might ever think to build. The reckoning had finally arrived in Tallahassee. The men it had been built to reach were already leaving. Chapter 9. The Brothers Who Got Out First. The transaction the brothers had been arranging while Tallahassee counted out its 30 days closed in the year 1969, and it lifted the whole of Gulf American out of their hands for a sum reported at more than $200 million. The buyer was a Pennsylvania finance house called General Acceptance Corporation, a company built on lending and installment paper, and it took title to everything the two brothers had assembled out of the Florida mangrove. Into that single purchase went the land itself, the roughly 100 square miles of dredged and undredged Cape Coral, and the great second tract in the cypress country near Naples, and the whole apparatus that had been built to sell them. It took the aerial brochures and the county plat maps, and the fleet of small propeller planes, the Fort Myers switchboards, and the national mailing lists. And above all, it took the paper, the filing drawers of signed installment contracts, and the coupon books still being torn 1 month at a time in kitchens 1,000 miles to the north. For all of it together, the record sets the price at better than $200 million, a figure that dwarfs every number the state of Florida had managed to attach to the same company 2 years earlier. By one account that later gathered around the sale, the two brothers divided something on the order of $63 million apiece, most of it taken not in cash, but in the shares of the buyer itself, though the surviving records report that division without ever fully settling it, and it is best held at arm's length until a primary business ledger confirms it. What stands without dispute is the shape of the thing, which is that the men who had conjured the city walked away from it whole and rich and gone, at the exact moment the ground beneath it was coming due. It was, in its way, the last and cleanest sale the brothers ever made, for the product this time was the machine itself. The entire engine of planes and plats and coupon books offered to one buyer across a single boardroom table instead of one wet lot offered to 40,000. Set the two reckonings side by side on the same desk, and the arithmetic the previous chapter left open sharpens into something colder than a single fine could ever look on its own. 2 years before this sale, the state of Florida had answered a 100-square-mile fraud with a penalty of $5,000, and now the men who had paid that penalty were cashing out for more than $200 million. Here the record forces a question with two faces, and only two. Was the $5,000 penalty the law of Florida at last closing its hand on a fraud it had taken the better part of a decade to name, the first hard mark set against the largest land operation in the country? Or was it a sum so small, weighed against a fortune of that exact size, that it amounted to nothing more than a license fee, the ordinary overhead of doing the business, paid without complaint so that the selling could quietly go on? The file sets the two numbers down beside one another and declines to choose between them, and the answer, if the record holds one at all, is left to whoever opens the folder and reads. What can be stated plainly is what the sale actually did, which was to lift the entire liability off the two men who had manufactured it and lower it onto a corporation that had bought the machine without ever fully reading the marsh underneath it. General Acceptance Corporation now held the deeds the drag line had never reached, and the canal front lots that were still open saltwater, and the printed promise on some 40,000 contracts near Naples that the ground would one day be made buildable. On paper, the buyer had acquired one of the great annuities in American real estate, tens of thousands of monthly payments arriving by mail from every state in the Union for land the purchasers had almost never seen. What it had truly acquired was the obligation underneath that stream of coupons, the standing water and the undug canals, and the buyers who would eventually fly to Florida and stand on the coordinates they had already bought. The papers that ended it were signed not on the Florida marsh, but in the dry order of a northern boardroom, a long way from the mangrove and the tide that the neat figures on the page described. The brothers, for their part, were finished with every piece of it. Leonard Rosen and Jack Rosen, who had begun with a single bottle of hair tonic in Baltimore and ended holding the largest inventory of platted Florida swamp in the nation, took their shares, stepped out of the company that still carried their fortune, and left the name behind them on the office door. They had timed the exit the way they had timed the whole enterprise, closing the sale before the buyer's complaints could harden into anything a courtroom might reach, before the true drainage bills came due, before the country's long appetite for a Florida lot bought by mail began, at last, to cool. The Land Sales Board had been built to reach these two men, and in the end it had reached only their signatures on a guilty plea and a check for $5,000. The instrument of the sale reached everything else they owned, gathered it into a single contract, and pointed it north toward Pennsylvania. And so the two men who had made the city disappeared cleanly out of the story of it, walking off the stage with their money, while the stage itself stayed precisely where it stood. The contracts stayed. The lots stayed, under the same shallow water where they had always been. The debt stayed, the whole unpaid weight of all that platted marsh, resting now on the books of a company that no longer had the brothers to work it. The men were gone. Everything they had sold was still there. Chapter 10. The Company That Inherited the Lie. Everything the brothers had sold was still there, and the whole unpaid weight of it had come to rest on a corporation in Pennsylvania that had never once stood on the Florida marsh it now owned. General Acceptance Corporation was a finance house, a company that understood coupons and interest and the steady arithmetic of installment paper, and what it had bought from the brothers was, on the surface of the ledger, a magnificent stream of exactly that. Tens of thousands of monthly envelopes still moved by mail from every state in the Union toward the Fort Myers offices, each one carrying a small payment on a numbered lot, and to a balance sheet in the North, that river of coupons looked like one of the surest incomes in American real estate. But a coupon is only the visible top of a contract, and beneath every one of them lay the same buried obligation the brothers had folded into the sale and walked away from. Printed into each of those agreements was a promise that the platted ground would one day be drained and dry and fit to build upon, and that promise now belonged in full to a company that had bought the paper without ever fully reading the swamp underneath it. The brothers had sold paper for a living and understood exactly what they were handing over. The corporation had bought paper for a living and appears never to have grasped that the collateral behind this particular paper was mangrove that went under at every high tide. It had valued the contracts the way it would value any loan book, by the reliability of the monthly payment, and it had counted the 40,000 promises out near Naples and the tens of thousands more at Cape Coral as assets rather than as debts the land itself would one day call in. That promise was written across 100 square miles of Cape Coral canal country and a second great tract of cypress marsh out toward Naples, and no volume of $10 payments could ever cover the dredging it would take to make the guarantee come true. The arithmetic that had made Leonard and Jack Rosen rich now ran in reverse for the men who had bought them out, because the same lot that yielded $10 a month on paper would swallow a small fortune in drag lines and drainage ditches before it became the waterfront the Platte had already sold. The corporation had acquired the coupons and inherited the canals, and only one of those two things could be carried into a bank. Around it, meanwhile, the ground was hardening into precisely the reckoning the Rosens had timed their departure to miss. The buyers' complaints, once scattered and filed and forgotten in a drawer, were gathering into lawsuits and the steady attention of Florida regulators. The long national appetite for a lot-bought sight unseen over a television set was beginning at last to cool, and the drainage bills the brothers had never meant to pay were arriving on a desk far to the north. For a few years, the corporation carried the weight, collecting its $10 a month against a coastline of standing water, borrowing against the coupons to buy time, and searching for a way to make the marsh pay for its own drainage. The marsh offered no such way, and it never had. In 1975, General Acceptance Corporation collapsed into bankruptcy. The company that had inherited the lie had gone down beneath the exact weight of it, undone by the obligation it had purchased and could not discharge, the same undug canals and underwater lots the brothers had gathered into a single contract and pointed north. But a bankruptcy filing closes the books of a company. It does not close the books of the households that company had been collecting from. Far up in the kitchens of Ohio and Michigan and New Jersey, the mailed coupon books were still being torn one page at a time, the small monthly payment still going out into the wreckage of the enterprise that had first written it down. $10 down and $10 a month, the whole machine compressed into a single phrase, was still arriving envelope by envelope from ordinary buyers who had signed for a piece of Florida and now owed their steady sum to a bankrupt corporation for ground that had never once risen out of the water. Some of them were paying still on lots that no surveyor could have located, numbered rectangles inked onto a Gulf American plat directly over 4 feet of tide. A share of those buyers eventually did what the fly-in couples had done a decade before, boarding an aircraft and flying south to stand at last on the coordinates they had been paying for, and where the brochure had drawn a canal and a building lot, they found only saw grass and shallow water and the same unbroken marsh that had lain there before the first drag line was ever floated. Out near Naples, the aftermath fell hardest of all, on the 40,000 purchasers of the company's second and larger tract, each of them holding a contract that promised buildable ground in a place the dredge had never reached, and now, with the seller bankrupt, never would. The guarantee had been made by 2 men who were gone, underwritten by a corporation that had failed, and owed to people who had trusted a television broadcast and a coupon book and a reply card mailed to an address that no longer meant anything at all. What a court could do with the whole of it was to close the corporate ledger, discharge the corporation's debts, divide whatever thin remainder was left among the creditors, and stamp the great file shut. What a court could not do was drain a single canal near Cape Coral or lift one platted lot out of the salt water it had always sat beneath. The ledger of the company could be closed in a courtroom in the dry and orderly paper of the North. The land kept its own books, and the land had not yet been paid. Chapter 11. The water keeps the account. The land kept its own books out in the low cypress country east of Naples, and the entries it recorded there were written not in coupons, but in canals cut across the swamp. That country was the tract the company had marketed as Golden Gate Estates, roughly 173,000 acres of Florida wetland, platted into numbered rectangles and sold by mail to some 40,000 buyers, and before the men who sold it walked away, they had done one thing to the ground thoroughly and forever. They had cut the water loose. To make a marsh read as dry, buildable lots on a plat, the dredge crews scored drainage canals across the whole of the low country, straight open channels driven through saw grass and standing cypress, each one meant to pull the sheet of water off the platted ground and hurry it away toward the coast. By the time the grid was finished, the estates near Naples held 813 miles of those drainage canals, a lattice of ditches laid through the swamp longer than the highway that carried the buyers' envelopes down from the northern kitchens where they had signed. That lattice of canal was never a thing that could be undug, and it did exactly what it had been dug to do, and it has not stopped doing it in all the years since the last salesman left the Cypress. Down the length of that canal system there runs, by the estimate of the water managers who later inherited the wreckage, some 233 billion gallons of fresh water a year, drained off the old wetland and delivered in a steady, unnatural rush into the salt shallows of Naples Bay. The bay had been an estuary, a shallow, brackish mixing ground where the slow seep of the cypress swamp had always met the incoming tide and held the fresh and the salt in the fixed proportion that the life of the water was built upon. The swamp the company drained had once been the bay's patient provider, holding its summer rain in the muck and the grass and letting it go a little at a time, a season-long release measured out through the wetland itself. The canal system ended that old arrangement in a single engineering stroke, converting the slow seep into a flood and pouring the swamp's stored fresh water into the salt water of the bay in a volume no estuary along that coast was ever shaped to receive. So the numbers of the place come to rest in a single stack, one figure resting on the next. 173,000 acres of wetland, cut through by 813 miles of drainage canal, sending an estimated 233 billion gallons of the swamp's own water every year into a bay that could not hold it. That was the true account of Golden Gate Estates, and none of it appeared in the brochure that sold the lots. What the brochure sold was a dry home site on a named street, and much of what the dredges left behind was a subdivision that drowned. Across the southern reaches of the tract, the platted grid still runs through empty marsh, mile after mile of straight canal and graded roadbed cut into cypress country where the houses the plat promised were never built and the numbered lots slid quietly back under water. The streets carry names and the canals carry water, and almost nothing else came, so that the aerial photographs show a vast drawn city inked over swamp, its geometry perfect and its ground uninhabitable, a place that was surveyed and sold and abandoned without ever once being lived in. The 40,000 buyers who had mailed their small monthly sums toward that grid received, most of them, a deed to a rectangle they could not find and could not build upon, marsh under open water in the wet months, and saw grass in the dry. And the cost of it all did not fall where a court could reach. The men who had platted the wetland and dug the canals had been paid and were gone, and the finance corporation that inherited the paper had failed and was gone, and the fine the state had once collected had long since been spent. What remained to carry the account was the ground and the water, the drained cypress that would not come back, and the estuary that took 233 billion gallons of misplaced fresh water a year for a debt it had never agreed to. The canals do not read a bankruptcy filing, and the bay does not forgive a discharged obligation, and the swamp keeps a record in the only currency it has, which is the water itself, moving down all those miles of open ditch toward a coast that changed color under the load. Long after the last coupon book had crumbled in some northern drawer, the account was still open in the Cypress, still being paid, every day, by the land and the sea that had been made to stand in for two men who never dug a foot of it. That was the reckoning the swamp near Naples carried, and it carried it alone. And yet 1,000 canals to the north, on the far tract at Cape Coral, the other drained swamp had done something that no one who sold it had ever actually promised it would do. It had become a real city. Chapter 12. The City That Came True Without Them. It had become a real city, and it had done so in the one manner its makers had never troubled to intend, by growing slowly into the promise on the Gulf American brochure long after the men who printed the brochure were gone. The Cape Coral that the company's airplanes once carried prospects into over open mangrove is today a genuine incorporated city on the Caloosahatchee, home to nearly 200,000 people who live on paved streets that carry the names the old Platte only drew. The lots that a dragline had once heaped out of the muck, and that a salesman had once sold as frontage on a ditch not yet dug, are now, most of them, precisely what the Platte had claimed of them: dry, buildable ground with a house set upon it and a seawall standing at the water's edge. Behind those houses run the canals, and the canals are the strangest part of the inheritance the whole scheme left behind. By the count kept in Cape Coral's own histories, the city holds more than 400 miles of navigable canal, a greater length of dug waterway than any other city on earth is said to carry, more than the canals of Venice, nearly every mile of it a spoil bank the company had carved and sold as waterfront years before a boat could float on any of it. What Gulf American had once platted as an illusion, the water has since made ordinary. From the air, the Cape Coral of the aerial photographs is no longer a drawn city inked over swamp, but a filled one, a dense grid of roofs and blue channels running out to the Caloosahatchee, the geometry the same and the ground beneath it finally solid. The very frontage that had been the company's central deception, the canal-side lot sold before the canal was dug, is now the thing that makes those lots worth having, the water view that a family will pay a premium to own. A boat idles behind house after house along those canals now, and a family carries a cooler down to a private dock on a channel that a Baltimore hair tonic salesman first drew on a table as a single line of ink laid across saw grass. The word the Platte had printed over open water had quietly come true, one filled lot and one poured seawall at a time, in the decades after the two men who wrote it had taken their money out of the swamp and left the state for good. For the people who came, and for the people who stayed, the fraud is not the story they live inside. A retired couple from Ohio who had once mailed a small monthly sum toward a numbered Cape Coral rectangle they had never seen came south when the dredge at last reached it, raised their children on the canal bank, and in time watched the grandchildren learn to swim off the seawall. The morning fisherman easing his skiff out of a Cape Coral canal toward the open river, the teenager hosing down a boat on a Saturday, the widow watering a row of hibiscus on a street that had been a survey line over marsh within living memory. These are real lives, honestly built, on ground that was honestly worthless the day it was first sold. Their children were christened in Cape Coral churches. Their dead were buried in Cape Coral cemeteries, and the town on the water became, for them, simply home, with no memory of a brochure attached to it. The dredges that were run to defraud them had, in the accidental long run, handed them a genuine coast to live on. None of that ever reached the two men who had conjured the place. Leonard Rosen and Jack Rosen had carried their fortune out of the mangrove and were gone before the ground came due, and they carried away with it every weight the ground would later gather. The drowned grid down at Naples, the bankrupt corporation in Pennsylvania, the buyers still mailing coupons into the wreckage. They had also, in leaving, walked away from the one thing the swamp finally produced that no brochure of theirs had honestly promised: the plain Saturday mornings of a working city on the water they had only ever meant to fake. Before the account is closed, there is a record still worth gathering, and only the people watching hold it. The descendants of the men and women who bought this ground by mail are scattered all through this audience. If your family once mailed away for a lot in Cape Coral or in Golden Gate Estates, if you live today on one of those 400 miles of canal, if there is still one of the company's coupon books folded in a drawer somewhere in your house, I would ask you to set it down in the comments the town the lot was bought from, and the town it was bought in, so that this record carries the names the brochures never bothered to keep. And if the making and the unmaking of an American place is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe to Empire of Acres, and the next account will come and find you. The two men had sold a city before it existed, and the last turn of the whole account, the one turn none of them arranged, is that the sentence stopped being a lie. The mangrove they drained is a coastline of streets and seawalls now, 400 miles of dug water holding up real boats in front of real houses where nearly 200,000 ordinary lives have been quietly and permanently made. And the men who invented the place in order to empty it of money never once came back to watch the place take hold. The city came true. It came true without them.